Most neighbors build fences. Some build privacy hedges. My neighbor built a river and pointed it straight at my backyard. The crazy part wasn't that he did it. It was that when I politely asked him to stop, he looked me dead in the eye and basically told me to get used to it. Looking back now, that conversation changed everything, because if he'd handled things differently, none of what happened afterward would have happened at all. My name is Ethan Walker, and a few years ago, I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, Missouri. Nothing fancy, just one of those middle-class communities where people wave at each other while mowing their lawns and spend way too much money trying to keep their grass greener than everyone else's. I'd lived there for almost 9 years. My wife, Sarah, and I raised our daughter there. We planted trees there. We hosted cookouts there. It was the kind of place where life moved slowly, and honestly, I liked it that way. Our next-door neighbor was a guy named Randall Pierce. Randall wasn't exactly friendly, but he wasn't openly hostile either. He was one of those people who treated every conversation like a business negotiation. If you said good morning, he'd answer with a nod that somehow felt like a warning. We never fought, never argued, never had any serious problems. We simply existed on opposite sides of a property line. Then one spring, everything changed. It started after a storm rolled through town one Friday night. The weather report had warned about heavy rain, but around here, heavy rain wasn't exactly unusual. The next morning, I walked outside carrying a cup of coffee and noticed a patch of standing water near the edge of my backyard. It wasn't huge, just enough to catch my attention. I shrugged it off. The ground would dry out in a day or two. No big deal. Except it didn't. A week later, another storm hit, and the puddle came back, bigger this time. Water stretched farther across the grass. The soil felt soft under my boots. A few areas looked almost swampy. Sarah noticed it too. "That's weird," she said while looking out the kitchen window. "We've never had water sit there that long before." She was right. During nearly a decade in that house, our yard had never flooded. Not once. Still, I told myself it was probably just an unusually wet season. Then came storm number 3. That one changed my perspective. The rain started around midnight and lasted until morning. When I walked outside, nearly a quarter of the backyard looked saturated. Water covered sections of grass that had never seen standing water before. The vegetable garden Sarah loved was partially underwater. One of our landscaping beds had begun washing away. That's when I stopped assuming and started paying attention. The next time rain was forecast, I made a point to stay home. Around dusk, dark clouds rolled in, and within an hour the sky opened up. Instead of watching television, I stood beside the house near the fence line, wearing a rain jacket and looking like a crazy person. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then I saw it. A stream of water suddenly shot out from behind Randall's property. Not a trickle, not runoff. A stream. I walked closer and realized he'd installed a brand new drainage pipe along the side of his yard. The thing was collecting water from his roof, gutters, and backyard, then dumping all of it through one outlet aimed directly downhill toward my property. I just stood there in the rain staring at it. Everything suddenly made sense. His yard was dry. Mine was becoming a pond. The next afternoon, I decided to be an adult about it. I walked over, knocked on his front door, and waited. Randall answered wearing work gloves and holding a cordless drill. "Hey," I said. "Got a minute?" He looked annoyed before I even started talking. "What's up?" I explained what I'd seen. I wasn't angry. I wasn't accusing him of anything. I simply pointed out that his new drainage system appeared to be sending a large amount of water into my backyard. "I was wondering if maybe you could redirect it somewhere else," I said. "Maybe toward a drainage basin or something." He stared at me for a second, then shrugged. "Water flows downhill." I laughed awkwardly because I thought he was joking. He wasn't. "Sure," I said, "but the pipe is concentrating everything into one spot." Another shrug. "Once it leaves my property, it's not my problem." Those exact words. Not my problem. I remember feeling my jaw tighten. Not because of the drainage issue itself, but because of the attitude. There wasn't even a conversation. No discussion. No compromise. Just a simple declaration that my problem didn't matter because it wasn't happening on his side of the fence. I left without arguing. Sarah asked how the conversation went. I told her. She rolled her eyes and said, "Well, that's not very neighborly." No, it wasn't. Over the next couple of weeks, things got worse. Every storm sent more water into our yard. The grass started dying in patches. The vegetable garden struggled. The ground remained muddy even during sunny days. One afternoon, I watched my daughter step into what looked like solid grass, only to sink ankle-deep into mud. She wasn't hurt, but seeing her frustration sparked something inside me. It wasn't just about water anymore. It was about someone creating a problem and refusing to take responsibility because they didn't personally suffer from the consequences. That's when I stopped asking myself how to convince Randall to care and started asking a very different question. What happens when the problem becomes his? That question sat in the back of my mind for days. Not because I was looking for revenge, at least not in the dramatic movie villain sense of the word, but because I genuinely couldn't understand how someone could look at a situation that obvious and simply decide it wasn't their responsibility. Every time another storm rolled through, I'd stand at the kitchen window and watch the same thing happen. Water would pour out of Randall's drainage pipe like a miniature waterfall, race across the property line, and spread through my backyard while his lawn stayed neat, dry, and untouched. It was almost impressive in a twisted way. He had engineered a solution that solved 100% of his problem by transferring 100% of it to somebody else. One Saturday morning, I grabbed a notebook, a tape measure, and a cup of coffee and started walking around both sides of my property. Sarah thought I was planning some kind of landscaping project. In a way, I was. The difference was that I wasn't focused on flowers or decorative shrubs. I was focused on water. For hours, I studied the contours of the land. Most people look at a yard and see grass. Once you start paying attention to drainage, you realize every property is really a collection of slopes, channels, low spots, and elevations. Water follows rules. It doesn't care about arguments or property lines. It simply goes where gravity tells it to go. The more I studied our lots, the more interesting things became. Randall had assumed the land only sloped toward my backyard. For the most part, he was right. But there was something he apparently hadn't noticed. Along the far side of my property, near a row of maple trees, the grade shifted slightly. It wasn't dramatic. Most people would never notice it. But if water reached that point, gravity would begin pulling it toward the back corner of Randall's yard. I must have walked that section 20 times before I was sure. Then I started sketching ideas. Nothing illegal, nothing destructive, just a way to keep water from spreading deeper into my property. If that process happened to redirect the flow toward the natural low point of the surrounding land, well, gravity would be making that decision, not me. A week later, I rented a small compactor, bought several tons of gravel, some landscaping fabric, decorative stone, and enough topsoil to fill a pickup truck twice. My next-door neighbor across the street, an older retired mechanic named Walter, watched me unloading materials and wandered over. Building a castle, he joked. Something like that, I said. He looked toward Randall's property and grinned. About time somebody did something. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had noticed the drainage issue. Over the next 2 days, I worked from sunrise until dark. I built what appeared to be an attractive raised landscaping border running along part of the property edge. From the surface, it looked completely ordinary. Decorative stone, mulch, a few ornamental plants Sarah picked out. The hidden part was underneath. Compacted soil, gravel layers, and a subtle elevation change created a barrier strong enough to redirect runoff without looking like a dam. Then came the second piece, a shallow gravel channel that followed the natural grade across my yard. Most visitors wouldn't even recognize it as drainage infrastructure. It blended into the landscaping so naturally that it looked intentional. By Sunday evening, everything was finished. Standing in the backyard, you would never suspect the entire project had been designed around one purpose. Sarah walked outside, looked around, and smiled. It actually looks really nice. That's because it is nice, I said. It's also useful. She studied my expression and laughed. You've been waiting to say that all week. Maybe I had. The first real test arrived 3 days later. The weather forecast predicted a major thunderstorm system moving through overnight. Around 10 o'clock, the rain began. By midnight, it was coming down hard enough to blur the streetlights. I found myself standing at the back window like a guy waiting for the final score of a championship game. Sarah eventually joined me. "You know this is ridiculous, right?" she said. "Probably. And you're still going to stand here watching?" "Absolutely." We both laughed. Then we watched. About 20 minutes later, the familiar stream appeared. Water exploded from Randall's drainage pipe exactly like before. Thousands of gallons of runoff rushed toward my yard. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the water struck the raised border. Instead of spreading across the grass, it turned. Smoothly, quietly, almost elegantly, the flow entered the gravel channel and began following the path I'd created. Sarah stared through the glass. "No way." "Yep." We watched as the water traveled along the edge of the property, curved around the maple trees, and continued toward the natural low point. Randall's low point. Nothing flooded. Nothing was damaged. The water simply ended up where gravity wanted it to go after my yard stopped absorbing it. For the first time in months, our backyard remained dry. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. The next morning, I stepped outside and immediately saw the difference. Our grass looked normal. The garden wasn't underwater. The ground felt firm beneath my boots. Then I looked toward Randall's property. His back corner looked terrible. Not destroyed. Not ruined. Just soaked. Muddy patches covered the area where the redirected water had collected. The exact condition my yard had been suffering through for weeks. I won't lie. Seeing it brought a certain level of satisfaction. Not because I wanted him to suffer, but because for the first time he was experiencing the consequences of his own decisions. The storms continued over the following weeks. Every rainfall repeated the pattern. Water exited his pipe, reached my barrier, traveled through the channel, and eventually returned to the lowest area available. Each storm left Randall's yard muddier. Each storm left mine drier. The change in his attitude became visible long before we actually spoke. He started walking his property after rainstorms. He'd stand near the soggy area with his hands on his hips. Sometimes he'd crouch down and inspect the mud. Once I caught him staring toward my landscaping project from across the fence. Another time, he measured something with a tape measure. I never said a word. Eventually, after roughly 2 weeks, there came a knock at my front door. I opened it and found Randall standing there. He looked tired, not angry exactly, more like a man who had finally realized the situation wasn't going away. "Got a minute?" he asked. The irony almost made me smile. "Sure." We stepped onto the porch. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "My backyard has been getting pretty muddy lately." "Really?" I said. "That's unfortunate." His eyes narrowed slightly. He knew I knew. I knew he knew. Neither of us felt the need to acknowledge it directly. "Did you change something?" he finally asked. I took a sip of coffee and nodded. I improved my landscaping to prevent water from entering my property, which was completely true. He looked toward the side yard. "That what all the gravel is for?" "Partly." Another long pause followed. I could practically see the internal debate happening behind his eyes. He wanted to argue. He wanted to blame me. But he also understood something important. Unlike his drainage pipe, my project existed entirely on my own property. I hadn't sent anything onto his land. I'd simply stopped accepting what he was sending onto mine. Finally, he sighed. "So what do we do about this?" There it was. The question I've been waiting weeks to hear. Not because it gave me power, but because it meant he was finally ready to solve the actual problem instead of pretending it belonged exclusively to someone else. I looked at him and remembered our first conversation, remembered the shrug, remembered the words, "not my problem," and for a brief moment I considered throwing those exact words back at him. It would have felt good, maybe even deserved. But the older I get, the more I've learned that winning an argument and solving a problem aren't always the same thing. So instead, I gave him the same answer I'd offered from the beginning. You need a proper drainage solution on your own property. A soak pit, an underground dispersal system, maybe a dry well. Something that handles the water before it leaves your yard. Randall stood quietly, staring out toward the street as rain clouds gathered again on the horizon. Then he nodded slowly. For the first time since this whole mess started, it felt like we were actually having a conversation. What happened next surprised me even more than everything that came before. Because less than a week later, a contractor's truck pulled into Randall's driveway. Then another one. Then a small excavator showed up. I remember standing at the kitchen window with Sarah while workers marked utility lines and unloaded equipment. She looked at me and raised an eyebrow. Looks like somebody finally decided water is his problem. I laughed harder than I probably should have. For the next several days, the crew dug trenches throughout sections of Randall's yard. They installed underground drainage lines, a collection basin, and a large dry well system designed to absorb runoff beneath the surface instead of dumping it across a property line. It wasn't a cheap project either. Even without asking, I could tell he was spending real money to fix something he could have addressed months earlier with a simple conversation. One afternoon, I happened to be outside when Randall walked over. The tension that had existed between us for months felt different now. Not gone, but softer somehow. He looked at the workers for a second before speaking. Should have done this from the start. It wasn't exactly an apology. Randall wasn't the kind of guy who handed those out easily. But for him, it was close. I nodded. Probably would have saved both of us some headaches. He gave a small laugh. Yeah. Then, after a brief pause, he added something I honestly didn't expect. I thought you were overreacting at first. I looked at him, and he shoved his hands into his pockets. Then I got to deal with it myself. There wasn't much else to say after that, because the truth had finally done all the talking for us. A few days later, the system was finished. The trenches were filled. New sod was installed. The equipment disappeared. Then we waited. Fortunately, Mother Nature didn't keep us waiting very long. About a week later, another major storm rolled through Cedar Ridge. The kind of storm that had started this entire mess months earlier. Rain hammered rooftops. Gutters overflowed. Wind bent tree branches. The perfect test. I found myself standing by the same back window where I'd watched so many previous storms unfold. Only this time, the feeling was completely different. The familiar stream never appeared. Water entered Randall's new drainage system and vanished underground exactly as it was supposed to. No artificial river. No flooding. No swamp forming in my backyard. Just rain doing what rain is supposed to do. The next morning, I walked outside and smiled before I even reached the grass. The yard was dry. Not perfectly dry, of course. It had rained all night. But normal dry. Healthy dry. The kind of condition it had been in for nearly a decade before all this started. Sarah's garden looked great. The lawn had recovered. The muddy sections were gone. For the first time in months, everything felt normal again. And that's when I realized something funny. The actual drainage problem had never been the biggest issue. Water was just water. It follows gravity. It can be redirected. It can be managed. The real problem had been something much simpler and much more common. Accountability. Randall didn't care when the consequences only affected someone else. The moment those consequences reached his side of the fence, solutions suddenly became available. Contractors appeared. Money was spent. Problems got solved. It's amazing how quickly that can happen. A few weeks later, summer arrived. The neighborhood returned to normal. Kids rode bicycles down the street. People mowed their lawns. Weekend cookouts filled the air with the smell of burgers and charcoal. If someone had moved into the neighborhood afterward, they never would have guessed there had been a silent little war happening between two backyards. Every now and then, I'd see Randall outside. We'd exchange a wave, sometimes even a brief conversation. We never became close friends, but we stopped being opponents. Oddly enough, things improved after both of us stopped trying to win. Looking back now, I don't regret building that landscaping project. Some people probably will. Some people will say I should have kept complaining, called the city sooner, hired lawyers, or pushed harder through official channels. Maybe they're right. Maybe there were other options. But what I learned from the experience is that sometimes people don't fully understand the impact of a problem until they experience it themselves. No amount of explanations, photos, or polite requests can compete with direct reality. And to be clear, I never damaged his property. I never blocked anything illegally. I never sent water somewhere it wasn't naturally capable of going. I simply stopped allowing my yard to serve as a free drainage solution for someone else's convenience. Gravity did the rest. The funniest part is that I still remember our very first conversation. I can hear it almost word for word. Water flows downhill. It's not my problem once it leaves my property. Back then, he said those words with complete confidence. Months later, after spending thousands of dollars on a proper drainage system, I suspect he hears them differently too, because in the end, the problem was solved the moment it stopped being only my problem. And honestly, that's the part that still sticks with me. Not the muddy yard, not the drainage pipe, not even the satisfaction of watching my backyard stay dry during that first storm. It's the reminder that communities only work when people recognize that their actions affect the people around them. The fence line may divide properties, but it doesn't divide responsibility. So now I'm curious what you think. Was I justified in building the barrier and redirecting the water naturally back toward the lowest point? Or should I have continued trying to handle it through conversations and official channels? At what point does protecting your own property become fair game? And where do you draw the line between solving a problem and teaching someone a lesson? Let me know down in the comments, because I've heard strong arguments on both sides of this story, and honestly, I think reasonable people can disagree. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor dispute, a property line conflict, or someone who suddenly cared about a problem only after it affected them personally, share your story below. And if you enjoyed this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around for the next story, because trust me, some neighbors build fences and some accidentally create enemies.